Cuba's history is a tapestry of resilience and transformation. This island nation, located in the Caribbean, has played a crucial role in global geopolitics. From its early days of indigenous cultures to the turbulence of the Cold War, Cuba's past is rich with significant events and figures. We will explore the impact of colonization, the struggle for independence, and the revolutionary movements that shaped modern Cuba. Key figures such as José Martí and Fidel Castro will be highlighted for their contributions to Cuban history. By the end of this essay, you will have a deeper understanding of the complexities and vibrancy of Cuban history. Let's begin this journey into the heart of Cuba's past. Cuba's strategic location has made it a focal point in various historical events. Before the arrival of Europeans, Cuba was home to indigenous groups such as the Taíno and Siboney peoples. These communities had their own social structures, cultures, and ways of life. They lived in harmony with nature and had developed sophisticated agricultural practices. The Taíno were the predominant group and were skilled farmers and fishermen. They cultivated crops like maize, yucca, and sweet potatoes. The Siboney, on the other hand, were more nomadic and relied on hunting and gathering. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 marked the beginning of a dramatic change. The Spanish colonization led to the decline of the Taíno and Siboney populations due to diseases and exploitation. Despite the devastating impact of colonization, the legacy of the Taíno and Siboney peoples continues to influence Cuban culture today. The Spanish colonization of Cuba began in earnest in the early 16th century. Diego Velázquez de Cuellar led the expedition that established the first Spanish settlements. The conquest was brutal, with many indigenous people perishing from violence and diseases brought by the Europeans. Spain's primary interest in Cuba was its strategic location and potential for wealth. Sugarcane plantations became the economic backbone of the colony. This led to the importation of African slaves, who worked under harsh conditions. The legacy of slavery left an indelible mark on Cuban society. Colonial rule in Cuba was marked by social stratification and economic exploitation. The island's wealth flowed to Spain, leaving many Cubans in poverty. Understanding this era is crucial for comprehending the roots of Cuba's later struggles for independence and social justice. The 19th century was a time of growing unrest in Cuba. The desire for independence from Spanish rule gained momentum. Various uprisings and movements emerged, driven by the harsh realities of colonial exploitation and the influence of neighboring independence movements in Latin America. One of the earliest significant uprisings was the 10 Years' War from 1868 to 1878. It was led by Cuban-born planters and other wealthy natives who were discontent with Spanish domination. Though it ended without achieving independence, it laid the groundwork for future efforts. The struggle continued with the Little War from 1879 to 1880 and other smaller uprisings. Cuban society was becoming increasingly polarized, with a growing number of people advocating for complete independence. Despite the failures and setbacks, these movements set the stage for the eventual success of the independence struggle in the early 20th century. Section 5. The rise of José Martí and the path to independence. José Martí is one of the most revered figures in Cuban history. Born in 1853, Martí was a poet, journalist, and revolutionary. His writings and speeches inspired many Cubans to join the fight for independence. Martí founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892 and planned a new war for independence. Martí's efforts culminated in the War of Independence from 1895 to 1898. Tragically, Martí was killed in one of the early battles of the war. His martyrdom galvanized the Cuban fighters and strengthened their resolve. Martí's legacy lived on, symbolizing the enduring spirit of Cuban nationalism. Section 6. The Batista Era: Economic Disparity and Social Unrest. After gaining independence, Cuba underwent a period of political instability. In 1933, Fulgencio Batista, a military officer, seized power. Batista ruled as a dictator from 1940 to 1944, and again from 1952 to 1959. His regimes were marked by corruption, economic inequality, and close ties with the United States. During Batista's rule, Cuba's economy grew, but the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. The majority of Cubans lived in poverty, social services were inadequate, and political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. The stark contrast between the wealthy elite and the poor fueled social unrest. This period also saw the rise of revolutionary movements. The growing discontent set the stage for the Cuban Revolution. Section 7. The Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro's fight for change. The Cuban Revolution began in earnest on July 26, 1953, when Fidel Castro and his followers attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Although the attack failed, it marked the start of a determined struggle against Batista's regime. Castro was captured and imprisoned, but later released in 1955. Castro and his brother Raúl fled to Mexico, where they met Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara. Together, they formed the 26th of July movement. In 1956, they returned to Cuba on a yacht named Granma and launched a guerrilla war from the Sierra Maestra Mountains. By January 1959, Batista fled the country, and Castro's forces entered Havana. The revolutionaries quickly took control, implementing sweeping changes aimed at addressing social inequalities. Section 8. The Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union brought it into the heart of Cold War politics. In April 1961, the United States attempted to overthrow Castro through the Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion failed, solidifying Castro's power and pushing Cuba closer to the Soviet bloc. The most dramatic Cold War confrontation was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The Soviet Union secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. When American spy planes discovered the missiles, a tense standoff ensued. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev engaged in intense negotiations. The crisis ended when the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a lasting impact on Cuba's international standing. It highlighted the island's strategic importance and the high stakes of Cold War diplomacy. Section 9. The Special Period and Economic Struggles. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 plunged Cuba into a severe economic crisis known as the Special Period. The loss of Soviet subsidies and trade left Cuba with shortages of food, fuel, and essential goods. The government introduced austerity measures and encouraged small-scale private enterprise to cope with the crisis. During this period, Cubans faced immense hardships. Public transportation became scarce, and blackouts were common. Despite the challenges, the Cuban people demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. The Special Period also led to significant social changes. By the late 1990s, the worst of the crisis had passed, and Cuba's economy began to stabilize. Section 10. Modern Cuba. Cultural richness and diplomatic changes. In recent years, Cuba has undergone significant changes. The thawing of relations with the United States during the Obama administration marked a new chapter. Diplomatic ties were re-established, and travel restrictions were eased, leading to increased cultural and economic exchanges. Cuba today is a vibrant mix of old and new. Havana's colonial architecture stands alongside modern developments. The island is renowned for its cultural richness, from music and dance to literature and art. Cuban culture reflects its diverse heritage, blending African, Spanish, and indigenous influences. Despite these modernizations, Cuba continues to grapple with its revolutionary legacy. Economic challenges persist, and political reforms are slow. As Cuba continues to evolve, it remains a fascinating and dynamic nation, proud of its past and hopeful for its future.